On the night of November 14th, 1581, a father struck his only competent son across the temple with an iron-tipped staff, and the blow opened a wound that would not close. The young man lingered for 4 days. He drifted in and out of consciousness. He called for his mother, who had been dead for 2 decades. He called for his wife, who had been sent away. He bled through the bandages and bled again, and the physicians in the palace at Alexandrov could do nothing but watch him slowly leave the world. When he finally died on November 19th, his father crawled across the floor of the chamber on his hands and knees. He pressed his face against the body. He wept until the candles burned out and the room went dark. Servants who heard it through the doors said the sound was not the sound of a man crying. It was the sound of something breaking. That father was Ivan IV, the Tsar the world would come to know as Ivan the Terrible, and this is how he killed his own dynasty. Before we dive in, comment where in the world you are watching from, and don't forget to click subscribe. To understand the killing, you have to understand the man. And to understand the man, you have to go back to a palace in Moscow in the 1530s, where a small boy sat at a window and watched the people who were supposed to protect him circle each other like wolves. Ivan Vasilievich was born on August 25, 1530, in the village of Kolomenskoye, just outside Moscow. His father was Vasily III, Grand Prince of Moscow. His mother was Elena Glinskaya, a young noblewoman of Lithuanian descent whose family had risen quickly and whose enemies were many. He was 3 years old when his father died of a sudden illness in December 1533. Vasily spent his final days demanding to be tonsured as a monk and given the last rites, which the boyars around him were reluctant to perform on a still-living prince. The death was slow and confused. The succession was immediate and uncertain. Elena, the boy's mother, claimed the regency for herself and held it for 5 years through what historians have described as a mixture of intelligence, ruthlessness, and the cold willingness to imprison any relative who threatened her position. She died on April 4, 1538. The boy was 8 years old. Modern forensic analysis of her exhumed remains in the 20th century found extraordinarily high levels of mercury, suggesting that she had almost certainly been poisoned. The chroniclers of the time recorded only that she had fallen ill suddenly and died within days. What happened to Ivan in the years that followed is one of the genuine missing chapters of Russian history. The boyar families, the Shuiskys, the Belskys, the Glinskys, fought each other for control of the regency and the throne. The child was a piece on their board. He was fed and clothed when it suited his keepers and ignored when it did not. He later wrote, in a letter to one of his former courtiers, that there had been days when he and his younger brother Yuri had gone without proper food, dressed in clothes meant for servants, treated as decorations in their own palace, while the boyars helped themselves to the treasury. He wrote about one specific memory that stayed with him for the rest of his life. He was sitting in a chamber with the boyar Ivan Shuisky. Shuisky had his boots up on the bed where Vasily III had died. The boy understood even at that age what the gesture meant. It meant, your father is gone, your mother is gone, and we sit where we like. The chronicles record that the boy began to find his own entertainment in those years. He climbed the towers of the Kremlin and threw dogs and cats from the heights, watching them break on the stones below. He rode through Moscow streets with a small band of young companions and trampled commoners under his horse. By 13, he had ordered the killing of Andrei Shuisky, one of the men who had sat on his father's bed, and the body had been thrown to the palace hounds. The chroniclers of the time recorded the killing in a single sentence. They did not record what the boyars said about it. They did not record what the boy thought. The record from those years is almost completely blank. That blankness, historians have argued for centuries, is where Ivan the Terrible was actually made. On January 16, 1547, at the age of 16, Ivan walked into the cathedral of the Dormition inside the Kremlin and had himself crowned. The title he took was new. No Russian ruler had ever held it before. He was not crowned Grand Prince of Moscow as his father and grandfather had been. He was crowned Tsar of all Russia. The word Tsar came from Caesar. The claim it made was enormous. It placed Ivan in his own conception as the successor not just to the rulers of Kiev and Rus, but to the Byzantine emperors, and through them to Rome itself. Moscow, in this vision, was the third Rome, the last true Christian empire, the inheritor of a sacred political authority that had passed from Constantinople into Russian hands. A month later, in February 1547, he married Anastasia Romanovna Zakharina, a young noblewoman from a family that was respected but not so powerful that the marriage would threaten the throne. The choice surprised the Russian court, which had expected him to take a foreign princess. He had instead chosen a Russian girl from his own land. The marriage, by every contemporary account, was genuinely happy. She gave him 6 children. 2 of them, the sons Ivan and Fyodor, would survive to adulthood. The early years of his reign looked nothing like what came later. He worked with a small circle of advisors, the priest Sylvester, the courtier Alexei Adashev, the metropolitan Macarius, who were collectively known as the Chosen Council. He issued a new law code in 1550. He convened the first Zemsky Sabor, an assembly of representatives from different ranks of Russian society, in 1549. He reformed the military and reorganized the system of local government. In October 1552, he marched on the Khanate of Kazan, a Tatar state that had raided Russian territory for decades, and after a long siege he captured the city. 2 years later, in 1556, he took Astrakhan as well. The Russian state suddenly stretched far beyond anything it had been in living memory. Volga trade routes that had been closed for generations were open. The young Tsar was being compared in the chronicles to the great rulers of antiquity. For a brief period, in the late 1550s, the Russian state looked like it was being built into something the world had never seen before. A vast Orthodox empire stretching across the eastern edge of Europe and into Asia, ruled by a young, capable, devout Tsar with a happy marriage and a growing family. Then, in the summer of 1560, Anastasia died. She had been ill for some time. The contemporary chronicles describe a wasting sickness. Centuries later, when her remains were exhumed, forensic analysis would find mercury levels in her hair so high that natural illness could be effectively ruled out. She had almost certainly been poisoned. Ivan, at the time, was convinced of it. He blamed the boyars. He blamed the men of the Chosen Council who had advised him for a decade. Within months, Sylvester was exiled to a remote monastery. Adashev was imprisoned and died, possibly by execution, possibly by his own hand, in 1561. The man who would become Ivan the Terrible was already standing inside the man who had been Ivan the Reformer. Anastasia's death was the door that led him out. Before we talk about what he did next, we have to talk about what he looked like and what he built around himself, because Ivan understood something that very few rulers of his era grasped. The image of power was, in many situations, more useful than the substance of it. He was tall by the standards of the time, somewhere around 6 feet, possibly more. The English ambassador Giles Fletcher, who saw him later in life, described him as gaunt, hollow-eyed, with the high cheekbones and long beard that would fix his image in every later portrait. He had a hooked nose. His hair receded early, and his remaining hair was reddish-brown going to gray. He moved with a stoop in his later years, the result of a spinal condition that the 1963 exhumation would confirm. His vertebrae were partially fused, and walking would have caused him constant pain. He carried a staff with him almost everywhere. It was tall, taller than a normal walking stick, and tipped with a sharpened iron point. It served as a cane when he needed one. It served as a weapon when he wanted one. Witnesses described him driving it into the floor when he was angry, into the foot of a courtier who displeased him, and eventually, in 1581, into the temple of his own son. The deeper apparatus he built around himself was even more deliberate. In December 1564, he left Moscow without warning, taking the treasury and the royal icons with him, and traveled to the small town of Alexandrov, about 70 miles to the northeast. From there, he sent 2 letters. One was addressed to the boyars and the clergy, accusing them of treason and announcing that he was abdicating the throne. The other was addressed to the common people of Moscow, telling them that he held no grievance against them, only against the nobles who had betrayed him. The reaction in Moscow was exactly what he had calculated. Crowds gathered in the streets. Delegations were sent to Alexandrov begging him to return. He agreed to return only on his own terms. The terms were the creation of a new institution called the Oprichnina. The Oprichnina was, in essence, a state within the state. Ivan divided Russia into 2 parts. The larger part, the Zemshchina, would continue to be administered by the Boyar Council in the traditional way. The smaller part, the Oprichnina, would be his personal domain, ruled directly by him through a body of men personally loyal to him alone. These men were called the Oprichniki. They were not soldiers in any conventional sense. They were enforcers. They wore black robes that resembled monastic habits. They rode black horses. They carried at their saddles 2 symbols that announced their function to anyone who saw them coming. A severed dog's head to show that they hunted the enemies of the Tsar, and a broom to show that they swept treason from the land. There were eventually around 6,000 of them. They were drawn from minor nobility, from common families, from anyone whose loyalty was to Ivan personally rather than to any older Russian institution. They were authorized to seize the lands of any boyar Ivan named. They were authorized to execute anyone Ivan named. They answered to no court. They paid no taxes. They wore their black robes through the streets of Moscow and people stepped out of their way. Ivan, in the records of the time, took to appearing in his own monastic robe. He played at being the abbot of his oprichniki, who were his monks. He led them in services in the church at Alexandrov. He drank with them at long tables in the great hall, and in the morning he sent them out to do what he had decided needed to be done. The theater of it was the point. A man who walks into your town wearing a black monastic robe with a severed dog's head hanging from his saddle has already told you what he is. You do not need to ask. You already know whether you will live through the day. The greatest expression of what the Oprichnina was, and what Ivan had become, was the destruction of the city of Novgorod in January 1570. Novgorod was the second city of Russia. It was older than Moscow. It had been a great medieval trading republic, connected to the Baltic and through it to the rest of Europe, with a tradition of self-government that went back to the 11th century. Moscow had absorbed it in 1478, but Novgorod's distinct identity, its commercial wealth, its older noble families, had remained intact. It was a place that Ivan, by all the evidence, had come to distrust. In late 1569, a denunciation reached him. An informant, possibly invented, possibly real, told him that the leaders of Novgorod were conspiring to defect to the Kingdom of Poland-Lithuania, which Russia was then at war with. The evidence was thin. The chronicles that have survived suggest that almost no one in Novgorod was actually doing what the denunciation claimed. It did not matter. Ivan decided that the city would be punished. He arrived at Novgorod on January 8, 1570, at the head of an army of oprichniki. The campaign that followed lasted approximately 5 weeks. The methodology was systematic. The Archbishop of Novgorod, Pimen, was arrested and publicly humiliated, paraded through the streets seated backwards on a horse. Monasteries were looted. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, the spiritual heart of the city, was stripped of its treasures. Merchants were brought before tribunals in the cathedral square, accused of treason and condemned without trial. The killings took place at the Volkhov River. Men, women, and children were brought to the bridge in groups, bound and thrown into the water. The river was frozen in January, but the oprichniki had cut openings in the ice. Soldiers in boats below the bridge waited with pikes and pushed back under anyone who tried to surface. The killings continued for weeks. The contemporary chronicler who recorded the events wrote that the river ran red. The number of dead has been disputed for 400 years. The lowest estimates from scholars working from the official Oprichnina records suggest around 2,000 executions. The highest estimates from the chronicles of the survivors run as high as 60,000. The true number is probably somewhere in the middle, perhaps 15 to 20,000, in a city whose pre-massacre population was around 30,000. The Russian historian Ruslan Skrinnikov, working from surviving administrative documents, estimated approximately 12,000 dead. Whatever the exact figure, the meaning was clear. Ivan had marched on his own second city, accused it of a treason that probably did not exist, and gutted it. He had not been opposed. The boyar families did not rise. The church did not stop him. The army did not refuse orders. The Russian state simply stood and watched while its own Tsar destroyed one of its own cities. When he was finished, he rode back to Moscow. The message that this sent to every other city in Russia, to Pskov, to Tver, to Yaroslavl, to the merchants and clergy and minor nobility of every settlement in the realm, was that there were no limits. There was no court to appeal to. There was no faction strong enough to restrain him. The Tsar would do whatever the Tsar decided to do, and the rest of them would survive or not according to his mood. It was the high watermark of his power. It was also, though no one quite understood it at the time, the moment after which everything began to come apart. In 1575, Ivan did something that no historian has ever been able to fully explain. He abdicated. He left the throne. He removed himself formally from the title of Tsar of all Russia, and he placed on the throne in his own seat a baptized Tatar prince named Simeon Bekbuletovich. Simeon was a real person. He had been born a Jenghisid, a descendant of the Mongol Khans, and he had converted to Orthodox Christianity and entered Russian service. He was a competent military commander. He was loyal. He had no power base of his own, and in the autumn of 1575, Ivan installed him in the Kremlin, had him crowned with what appeared to be full ceremony, and began signing documents addressed to him as a humble subject petitioning his Tsar. Ivan moved out of the main palace. He took up residence in a more modest building in Moscow. He referred to himself as Ivan of Moscow, a boyar. He addressed his petitions to the new Tsar in the formal language of submission. For approximately 11 months, Russia officially had a different ruler. Nobody knew what to do. Foreign ambassadors sent confused dispatches home. The boyars went through the motions of treating Simeon as the sovereign while privately understanding that Ivan was still the actual power. Decisions of any consequence still had to pass through Ivan's hands. Orders went out under Simeon's name, but in Ivan's voice. In the summer of 1576, without any more explanation than he had given the year before, Ivan returned. Simeon was quietly removed from the throne and given a substantial estate as compensation. He lived for another 40 years, well into the next century, and outlived most of the men who had served under him. The historical interpretations of this episode vary widely. Some scholars treat it as a piece of political theater, an attempt by Ivan to test the loyalties of his courtiers, to see who would commit to the new regime, and thus reveal themselves as disloyal. Others read it as a way of legally voiding certain debts and grants made under the previous administration, since technically a new Tsar was not bound by them. Others have suggested it was a religious gesture, perhaps a self-imposed penance for the sins of Novgorod. And some historians have read it as something simpler and darker. They have read it as evidence that by 1575, Ivan was no longer in full control of his own decisions, that the man who returned to the throne in 1576 was not the same man who had left it in 1575, that something had begun to break inside him, and the abdication was the first visible crack. Whatever it was, the years that followed did not look like a return to stability. The Oprichnina had been formally dissolved in 1572, but the violence had not ended. It had only changed form. The black-robed enforcers were gone. The lists of names were not. The threat that finally destroyed Ivan was not an external one. It was not a rival kingdom. It was not a noble conspiracy. It was something that grew inside his own mind, and the evidence of it was scattered across the last decade of his reign in 100 small and large incidents that, taken together, describe a slow, observable collapse. The forensic evidence is striking. When Ivan's tomb in the Cathedral of the Archangel inside the Kremlin was opened in 1963 by a team led by the Soviet anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov, the bones were analyzed for trace metals. The mercury concentration in his remains was found to be far above the level explainable by ordinary exposure. Bismuth and arsenic were also present at elevated levels. Whether the mercury was administered as medical treatment for syphilis, which is one common explanation, or as treatment for the pain of his spinal condition, which is another, or whether it represented deliberate slow poisoning by his enemies, which is a third, the cumulative neurological effects of long-term mercury exposure are well documented. They include paranoia, mood instability, sudden rages, tremor, and progressive cognitive decline. What the chroniclers of the time recorded matches the forensic picture. The executions, which had been calculated and political in the 1560s, became erratic. Men were arrested for slights. Lists of the condemned were drawn up by Ivan himself in his own hand in the form of synodicons, prayer lists for the souls of those he had killed, that he sent to monasteries with payments for the monks to pray for them. Some of these lists survive. They contain thousands of names. He was, in some sense, keeping a record of his own crimes, and asking the church to handle the spiritual consequences on his behalf. His seventh wife, his eighth wife. The exact count is disputed because the Russian church only formally permitted 3 came and went. Some were sent to convents. One, Maria Dolgorukova, was reportedly drowned within days of the wedding when Ivan decided she had not been a virgin. Whether that incident is fully historical or partly legend has been debated. The pattern that it represented was not debated. He had episodes of religious mania, in which he would shut himself in a chapel for days, beating his head against the floor of the church until his forehead bled. He had episodes of cruelty in which he watched executions personally, sometimes taking part. He had episodes of remorse in which he wept for the souls of the men he had killed, and donated vast sums to monasteries to pray for them. The court around him learned to read his moods the way sailors read the sky. They learned which days they could approach him, and which days they could not. They learned which subjects could be raised and which could not. They learned never, under any circumstances, to be the bearer of the news he did not want to hear. His son and heir, also named Ivan, was 27 years old in the autumn of 1581. The Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich was, by every contemporary account, a capable and intelligent young man. He had ridden with his father on campaigns since adolescence. He had been present at the Novgorod massacre at the age of 16 and had reportedly participated. He understood power. He understood his father. He had grown up watching the man and had learned to survive him. He was the future of the dynasty. He was the only son Ivan had who could conceivably rule. The other surviving son, Fyodor, was a gentle and physically weak young man whom the court regarded with affection and quiet alarm. Fyodor was, in the polite language of the time, simple. He preferred prayer to politics. He had no aptitude for command. The whole Russian state in the autumn of 1581 was resting on the shoulders of the elder son. Everyone in the palace understood it. The Tsar understood it. The Tsarevich understood it. And then, on the night of November 14th, in the residence at Alexandrov where Ivan had once played at being the abbot of his oprichniki, something happened that no one in the palace had quite prepared for. The Tsarevich Ivan was married to a young woman named Yelena Sheremeteva. She was the third of his wives. The previous 2 had been sent to convents for failing to produce heirs. Yelena, by the autumn of 1581, was pregnant. The dynasty, in the most literal sense, was inside her. The accounts of what happened on November 14th have come down to us through several sources, the most detailed being the report of the papal legate Antonio Passavino, who was at the Russian court in those years, and who interviewed witnesses afterwards. Other accounts come from the chronicles of the Trinity Lavra and from the diplomatic correspondence of the period. The accounts do not agree on every detail. They agree on the essential shape. Ivan walked into the chambers of his son and daughter-in-law unannounced. Yelena was in a state of undress that he considered improper. She was wearing only an undergarment in the heat of her own apartments in the presence of no one but her servants. To Ivan, in the mood he was in, this was a violation. The wife of the Tsarevich did not appear in such a state. He struck her. He struck her hard, possibly with the staff, possibly with his hands. She fell. That night she miscarried. The Tsarevich came to confront his father the next morning. The argument that followed has been reconstructed from the surviving accounts. It began with the miscarriage. It moved quickly into older grievances. The Tsarevich had been pushing his father for months to be given command of an army to relieve the city of Pskov, which was under siege by the Polish King Stefan Battery. The father had refused, suspecting that any military success by the son would be the beginning of a coup. The son had grown impatient. The argument that began over the dead pregnancy expanded into the larger one about the war, about command, about the question of when, if ever, the father intended to share or surrender any portion of his power. At some point in the argument, the father raised his staff. There is a line that the chronicles record, though its precise wording is disputed across sources. The father is said to have shouted at the son that he was a rebel, that he was a traitor like the boyars who had killed his mother, that he would die before he saw his son sit on his throne. The son is said to have answered quietly that one of them was going to outlive the other, and they both knew which one. The staff came down across the temple. The iron point caught the side of the young man's head. He fell. There is a painting of this moment by Ilya Repin, finished in 1885, that hangs now in the Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. It is one of the most famous paintings in Russian art. It shows the father, an old man with wild eyes and a long, thin face, cradling the head of the dying son in his lap. Blood is pouring from the wound onto the carpet. The father's mouth is open in something between a wail and a question. He is pressing his hand against the wound as if he can hold the life inside the body if he presses hard enough. He cannot. The painting captures what every account of the night agrees on, which is that the moment the blow landed, the father understood what he had done. The young man lingered for 4 days. Physicians were brought in. The Tsar himself sat by the bed. He prayed. He wept. He sent messengers riding to monasteries across the realm asking for prayers. He promised God anything. The wound, by all accounts, was a depressed skull fracture with bleeding into the brain. There was nothing the medicine of 1581 could do. The Tsarevich Ivan Ivanovich died on November 19, 1581. He was 27 years old. He had been the heir to the throne of Russia for his entire life. He left behind the wife he had defended, no children, and a father who, when the body was finally still, crawled across the floor and pressed his face into it, and made a sound the servants outside the door could not later describe. Ivan IV lived for another 2 years and 4 months. He was, by every account, a different man in those final years than he had been before. He did not lead campaigns. He did not appear in public except when ceremony required it. He spent his days in prayer and his nights, by some accounts, walking the corridors of the Kremlin and speaking to people who were not there. He died on March 28, 1584, while preparing to play a game of chess. He collapsed at the board. The pieces he had set up are recorded in the accounts. He was setting up the white pieces. He never made his first move. The throne passed, as everyone had known it would have to Fedor. The new Tsar was 26 years old. He was devout. He was kind. He was, in the assessment of nearly every contemporary, completely incapable of ruling. He preferred ringing church bells to issuing decrees. He spent hours in prayer. He delegated the actual business of governing to his brother-in-law, a capable boyar named Boris Godunov, who would eventually take the throne himself. Fyodor died childless in January 1598. The Rurik dynasty, which had ruled the Russian lands in some form since the 9th century, since before there was a Moscow or a Kremlin or a Tsar, was extinct. 700 years of a single bloodline ended with a gentle, simple man dying quietly in his bed, and the throne behind him stood empty. What followed is known in Russian history as the Time of Troubles. Famine in 1601 to 1603 that killed perhaps a third of the population in some regions. A succession of pretenders to the throne, including two separate men who claimed to be a younger son of Ivan named Dmitry who had supposedly survived an assassination attempt as a child. Polish armies in Moscow, Swedish armies in the north. Civil war. The Kremlin itself occupied by foreign troops. The Russian state nearly ceased to exist. It did not fully recover until 1613, when a Zemsky Sobor elected a 16-year-old boy named Mikhail Romanov as the new Tsar. The Romanovs, the family of Ivan's first wife Anastasia, would rule Russia for the next 304 years, until 1917, when another collapse of a different kind would end them as well. In 1963, the Soviet authorities opened Ivan's tomb in the Cathedral of the Archangel inside the Kremlin. The anthropologist Mikhail Gerasimov, who had developed a technique for reconstructing faces from skulls, performed the examination. He measured the bones. He analyzed the tissue. He found the mercury and the bismuth and the arsenic. He found the spinal fusion that would have made every step painful in the last decade of life. He reconstructed the face from the skull. The result, which is on public display, shows a man who looks exactly like the portraits. Hollow-eyed, gaunt, long-bearded, the face of someone who had spent the last years of his life in pain that he had no name for. The staff, the actual iron-tipped staff he carried, was not recovered. It is mentioned in the inventories of the Kremlin treasury from the late 16th century, and then it disappears from the records. Whether it was buried with him, melted down by some later Tsar who did not want it in the building, or simply lost in one of the many fires and lootings of the Kremlin over the centuries, no one knows. Ilya Repin's painting of the killing of the Tsarevich was attacked in 1913 by a mentally ill man with a knife who slashed the canvas 3 times. It was restored. It was attacked again in 2018 by a different man with a metal pole who shattered the protective glass. It was restored again. The painting seems to draw out, in certain visitors, something it does not draw out in others. It is one of the most damaged and most repaired paintings in Russian museum history. The room at Alexandrov where the killing happened is still standing. It is part of a museum complex now. Visitors walk through it. The floor has been replaced many times. There is no marker on the spot. The local guides, when they tell the story, tell it quietly. He was not the most successful Tsar in Russian history. He was not the longest reigning. He was not the most popular with his own people, then or later. But he was the one who understood something that very few rulers in any era have been willing to act on, which is that absolute power, if it is allowed to recognize no limit, will eventually find the only limit it has not yet tested. The limit is not the army. The limit is not the church. The limit is not the boyars or the foreign powers or the law. The limit is the bloodline itself. The limit is the body of your own son. He turned himself into the kind of Tsar that no Russia after him could ever quite forget. He built an apparatus of terror, and then, when the apparatus had nothing else left to consume, he watched it turn inward and devour the only thing he had ever genuinely loved. The iron staff, the wound at the temple, the 4 days of dying, the empty throne that followed and the 7 centuries of dynasty that ended with it, the painting that visitors still come to attack, the legend never died at all. Ivan Vasilievich built himself into something more than a Tsar. He built himself into the warning that every absolute ruler since has tried, and mostly failed, to learn from. The man who killed his own son with his own hand and then crawled across the floor to weep over the body, and could not understand, in the 4 days of that boy's slow dying or the 2 years of his own afterwards, that the hand had been his own all along. If this story kept you hooked, hit subscribe and catch the next one.